So our first speaker is coming from way, way, way down under, the southernmost part of Australia, southernmost state of Australia. Rob King is a marine biologist with 25 years experience undertaking research on Antarctic krill with the Australian Antarctic Division. His focus has been on understanding living krill, and he specializes in the creation of really cool terrestrial and ship-based aquarium systems so that he can keep krill alive and study them in those systems. And those systems enable research on all life stages of Antarctic krill and allow you to keep looking at and studying these animals for a lot longer than you could if you just had a brief, say, 2-month research voyage to the Southern Ocean. Recently, his research has focused on the effects of ocean acidification on krill development in the laboratory. And Rob's field research includes undertaking research voyages to the Southern Ocean, both to estimate the biomass of Antarctic krill for fisheries and fisheries management, but also to deploy bespoke moorings to understand the behavior of krill in swarms and to assess the importance of the seafloor habitat for krill during the really intense seasonal environmental changes that we experience or they experience in the Antarctic. So I'm really excited to hear Rob's talk this year. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Rob and let him take it away. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much. We'll just share screen here. How's that? Coming through loud and clear?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Moina people, their elders past and present, and on whose lands I am presenting to you from today here in Tasmania. My opening slide tells you something about me. I've got a very krill-centric view of our planet, and I hope by the end of this talk you'll understand how I've come to that opinion. Like many of the people we've heard from in this symposium, I grew up by the sea and just became fascinated. I was one of those kids that would just spend the entire day in a rock pool, poking and prodding things and becoming just fascinated in everything in the sea, moving as I got older into diving and surfing. And when it came time to go to university, I went naturally into marine biology up in Townsville in Northern Australia. I completed my studies up there, but the heat was too much, and I rather overcompensated by coming past Tasmania and coming all the way back to, oh, I've lost my image here. Hang on, just coming back in again. Coming all the way back and going past Tasmania. Why that is not sharing, I'm not sure. Just bear with me for a moment. Coming back into the presentation mode, and it is going blank each time. So hang on, we'll just fight through this and figure out what's going on. If you've got any ideas, Casey, that would be most welcome.
I have not got any ideas at the moment, but I think, can you see a slide beyond this second one that you're trying to move to?
Yeah, we'll just go to the second one and see if we can bring that up.
Maybe you can look at that here, and then maybe if the third slide works, you can.
Yeah, we're good.
I see it.
Yeah, that is a weird one. Anyway, there you go. I mean, there's a bit of distance between us. So anyway, so back into the talk. So now I work for the Australian Antarctic Program, and we're based in Hobart in Tasmania there. And we run 3 stations on the continent of Antarctica: Mawson, Davis and Casey, you can see on the map, and a sub-Antarctic station, Macquarie Island. And our organisation is all about doing world-class science of critical national importance and global significance. And this includes glaciology, taking ice cores to understand the past climates of Earth, upper atmospheric sciences, and of course, biology, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, when I first saw the Antarctic, I was 24 years of age, and the view I saw was the one at the bottom. That's Mawson Station. And it's almost pointless describing this to you because you have to see this to really take it in. It is absolutely awe-inspiring. That sheet of ice in the background covers the entire continent, and the stations in Antarctica are just perched on the edge. And as a young 24-year-old, I just wanted to charge off behind the station with crampons on my feet and go and explore. And of course, I was naive, and I certainly wasn't allowed to do that. You need to be much better prepared, not just for what you find, but for what will happen to you if things go wrong. It's very remote. So I couldn't do that at that location, but at the next station we went to, I went off to explore the biology at Casey Station. And this is an Adelie penguin rookery at Casey Station. And while you can see all the black and white penguins there, what's really noticeable is the pink ground underneath them. And that's pink because it's stained with their waste, because these penguins have been eating almost exclusively Antarctic krill. It's the astaxanthin in krill staining the ground there. It shows you just how important krill are as a diet for these animals. Now, I was looking at these penguins from a rubber boat in Casey Harbour, and you can cruise right up to the ice cliffs and look in, and the penguins will stare down at you. It's just absolutely fascinating. It was a totally still, silent day, like the one pictured here. And then, totally unbeknownst to me, I've just felt some presence behind me, and I turned around, and there in the water behind me was an enormous 3.5 meter leopard seal weighing 400 or 500 kilos, and it was above me. So I was sitting on the side of the rubber boat. It was arm's reach away from me, and it had silently slipped into a position where it was above me, looking down at me, just doing the milkshake with its hind flippers in the water. It opened its mouth, and my life flashed before me, and I thought, gosh, what a short career this has been, working on the food web in the Southern Ocean. You're about to become part of it. You can probably guess that's not what happened. It just closed its mouth and slipped back into the water after baring its teeth at me. But really was an incredible experience in my life. But what's really interesting, and I certainly didn't notice this at the time, was that its mouth is huge. It's designed for biting penguins and seals and things. My head would have fitted in it, no problem at all. But the teeth in the mouth of the leopard seal, the front ones are the ones you notice, the big sharp canines, but the back teeth are these tricuspid teeth, and they form a filter. As the mouth closes, they can filter water with it. And what are they filtering? Krill, of course. So this is almost the apex predator in the Southern Ocean. It's not quite, it's usurped by the killer whale, which you're going to hear about from Amy in the next talk. But this is a very high level predator, and even this predator is adapted to switch to taking mouthfuls of water and sieving krill out of it. So once again, krill are just so ubiquitous through this ecosystem, everything relies on it. And incidentally, that picture of me on the boat there was taken only 3 years ago in Casey Harbour. I'm still sitting on the side of a rubber boat at the same place that leopard seal appeared. And that's perhaps not that brilliant, but it's a good way to make a point that to be a scientist, you don't need to be brilliant. You've just got to be curious and tenacious. You just have to want to observe and understand. You don't have to be brilliant. And I think just casually sitting there on that rubber boat is a good example of that. So today I'm going to talk about why krill matter, the fishery, their life cycle, understanding them in swarms, because this is a swarming organism, how climate change is affecting them, how we use acoustics to understand their predators and the krill, and also looking at the alternative krill habitat of the seafloor and ecosystem conservation. So jumping right in, why do krill matter? Well, there's about 85 species of krill around the planet. And today I'm only talking about one species, the Antarctic krill, Euphausia superba. Now, these guys eat phytoplankton predominantly. These are the microscopic plants in the ocean, and they take in carbon dioxide and water using the energy from sunlight, and this feeds the ecosystems of the ocean going up through krill. Now, Jim gave us a really good introduction on day one about how these organisms in the ocean, the deep sea, provide ecosystem services, and krill are part of that chain, because when they take in the phytoplankton, they take out what they can extract, but they pass all the phytoplankton up, and then basically down comes the fecal matter from the krill, which rains down into the deep ocean, and taking with it carbon from the surface ocean. More phytoplankton will grow, and more carbon dioxide will dissolve in from above, reducing the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Now, 9 billion tons of carbon dioxide from anthropogenic sources dissolves into the world's oceans each year. And there's quite a bit of krill out there, and they're doing quite a bit of that job of pumping it into the deep ocean. This is what's known as the biological pump. Now, krill pass that energy on, just like the herring that Steve and Eleni talked about yesterday, to the higher order predators. But it's on a much greater scale in the Southern Ocean. So we have seals, penguins, flying seabirds, fish, squid, and of course the great baleen whales. Now, this is a very simplified food web I've shown here, and it's of course much more complicated. And we have molecular biologists doing work just like Kim described so well on day one as well, trying to map out all the intricacies of this food web, who's eating who and who's present, using DNA and environmentally shed DNA to answer those sorts of questions. But for now, we're going to focus just on this simplified food web. And it's because there is just so much krill out there. This single species has a biomass, that means the weight of biological material that's krill, of up around 500 million tons potentially. It's very hard to survey because the environment is so large. But that's just a big number. To get a feel for what that number means, we need to look at all of the biomass on Earth. And if we look at this figure down the bottom left, you can see that Earth is ruled by plants. Plants are by far the greatest weight of living material on Earth, and even bacteria at number 2 is huge, microscopic bacteria. Animals are the tiny little grey triangle in the bottom right corner there. But if we magnify that triangle, we can see that insects and crustaceans dominate the animal kingdom, and fish come in second. Now, if we put the single species of Euphorsia superba on this little figure, it is staggering how much of a proportion of all animal life on Earth is Antarctic krill. 1/40th of all living animal tissue on Earth is an Antarctic krill, Euphorsia superba. That is why it is so critical to get the management of krill right to protect this ecosystem and everything it delivers. Now, perhaps even more staggering than that is this other species on here, which eclipses the biomass of krill, and that is humans. If there's ever been a clarion call to behave ourselves and think about our impact on the environment, it is realizing that we are the most abundant in terms of weight of any species on Earth. All of the whales, seals, and so forth are in that tiny sliver of wild animals next to humans. It just gives you a feeling for how much responsibility we really have. And humans are now taking krill as part of a fishery. So looking at the krill fishery, it's been going since the 1970s, but it's been well managed by a body set up under the Antarctic Treaty called CAMLR. And CAMLR has divided the Southern Ocean into a whole bunch of different catch areas so that we can survey the krill in those areas and set catch limits. And it's all about preserving krill for the ecosystem and not just maximizing the yield of catch. Now, the catches dropped off in the 1980s with the breakup of the USSR, but then it's been steadily growing again since that time. And the fishery restricted to the Antarctic Peninsula, but then with sea ice changes, with the climate changes that are coming, the fishery is able to fish in the winter time as well as the summertime around the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's concentrated there, but the trigger points for moving the fishery out of catch areas as they hit the catch limits has begun happening in the last 5 years. And so the fishery is now moving back around to the East Antarctic side as well. But I don't want any of this to scare you, because you have to understand that the fishery is 0.1% of the krill biomass at this stage. And that's around 425,000 tonnes a year. And the precautionary catch limit is in the order of 10 million tonnes. So it's very well managed, and it's got enormous potential, and an important potential given the human population's predicted to go from 7 to 9 billion by 2050. This is an important source of food, but it won't be there if we don't manage the ecosystem, because ecosystems support fisheries. Now let's have a look at a krill itself. Here's a krill swimming. They're effectively swimming machines at the back end and feeding machines at the front. They can scrape food off ice, but most of their living is made by just filtering phytoplankton from seawater. And here you can see the feeding basket at the front end. It just beats, and the phytoplankton get caught on their legs, and they flick it onto the stomach and digest it. But although that's the main thing krill do, they really are opportunists. And much like Ileana told us about the famous burrito-eating jumbo squid, I reckon if you threw a burrito into a tank of krill, they'd probably eat it. Animals just need to eat. They need to grow, then they need to reproduce. That's why they're there. Most animals will have a crack at anything. Now, the life cycle of krill. you might be surprised to know they grow to 6 centimeters in size. Most krill are tiny. The tropical species are the smallest. You fit several on your thumbnail. They get bigger as you go towards the poles. And these krill grow up to 6 centimeters and a gram each. Their lifespan, 5 to 7 years. We can keep them for over 11 years in the lab. They can grow and shrink. So in Antarctic winter, when there is no sun and therefore very little phytoplankton, they can reduce their body size to survive the Antarctic winter. They have photophores underneath them, so they can countershade from predators attacking them from underneath, but it's also likely to be very important when schooling. Krill form, there are male and female krill, and they form schools at the surface. And you can see the krill on the left of the main image there. That's a female full of eggs under the carapace. And they spawn maybe 3,000 eggs at the surface, which sink to 1,000 meters deep over 5 days, where they hatch. And just like sablefish eggs that Matt talked about, they hatch with no mouth, and they spend the next 3 weeks swimming with their antennae to get to the surface. The image in the top right corner there is a Nauplius larvae, the hatching stage of krill, and it swims 1 kilometer vertically just on the energy provided by mum to get there. It goes through 2 larval stages and then arrives as a Caloptopus larvae in the surface, where it develops a mouth and starts feeding on phytoplankton. After 2 more of those phases, it becomes a Phacelia larva, which is the one on the bottom right. And this is the one that really schools. And these are tightly associated with the sea ice, dropping down into the water column at night to feed, and then hiding in the sea ice as a nursery area during daylight when predators can get it. Really important thing about krill is they're obligate schoolers with a colossal biomass. And here you can see one of our research tanks in the aquarium here in Tasmania. These are Antarctic krill, and we've dropped a plastic sheet, a black plastic sheet, into this white tank, and all the krill have charged off into the bottom left corner, and they'll all come swimming out totally lined up in a fast swimming school together. And this is all about dazzling visual predators, so that the visual predator, like a penguin, a seal, or a fish, can't decide which krill to eat. And that black sheet represents a change in contrast in their environment, which is what an approaching predator looks like. Now, krill form vast schools, and here you can see a map of a krill school under our research ship. This school would be tens of thousands of tons of krill in a single school. And these schools can go for a long way. So here you can see some sped up footage of us trying to map a krill school. And this one is just almost impossible to map because it just stretches for tens of kilometers. And these krill layers can go for hundreds of kilometers across the Southern Ocean. The pink and red bits are the densest. The greeny blue bits are not so dense. But we're looking here at, again, tens of thousands of tons. And you can see all the sea that we haven't surveyed probably also has a large amount of krill in it. Now, while these krill are schooling to avoid visual predators, this falls right into the lap of the baleen whales, who are adapted only because krill school to take a mouthful of school and then squeeze the water out. So it's a bit of an arms race between krill, but at the moment, the fact that krill school tells you that it's much better to be a schooling animal and just take the hits you get from baleen whales. So understanding schooling is something that we've long been fascinated about. And in the aquarium, we've managed to unravel how krill begin to form schools using stereo cameras. And we really wanted to check if this held true in the environment. So on the last voyage we did in February, March this year, we managed to drop a camera system, which you can see on the bottom left there, into the edge of this krill school. We first mapped the krill school with echo sounders. And then you can see those orange transducers. They're the echo sounders on the swarm study frame. And below you can see pairs of video cameras underneath. Once we dropped it off the ship, it was held at the right depth by this surface buoy, and you can see the humpback whales feeding on this krill school at the same time. And then with the ship's echo sounder, this is a different sort of echo sounder, like a sonar. The ship is in the middle of that disc. You can see the krill school that we've dropped the frame into, and that little red lump in the bottom right corner of that blobby krill school is the camera frame doing its job. And we were delighted to get back stereo images of wild krill schooling. And here you can see some of the data being analysed at the moment, where each of those individual krill we have stereo images for, which means we know their velocity, we know their acceleration, and we know the nearest neighbour distances. So this is going to help us understand in the wild how krill form schools, which is important for understanding how predators will relate to those schools and how krill will relate to fishing gear that's put through them. All of this is really groundbreaking stuff, and it's only because of the technology available today that we can image a school and then accurately drop a camera system into them. So climate change and krill. Well, as I already said, those Phacelia larvae that you can see in this image are tightly associated with sea ice, and we know that sea ice is predicted to decrease not only in surface area, but also in complexity in terms of volume as climate change progresses. So this is going to remove nursery habit for krill. But there's a more pressing problem, and that's coming from ocean acidification. You remember we talked about this biological pump where krill are packaging up phytoplankton and sending it to the depths in feces. Well, as that sinks, as Jim talked about earlier, bacteria break that down and re-release that carbon dioxide at depth. So you get a spike in carbon dioxide at depth, but it doesn't sit there as dissolved carbon dioxide. Most of it quickly reacts with water to form carbonic acid. And this reduces the pH of the water, makes it more acid, less alkaline. And this is what's known as ocean acidification. And we suspected that krill eggs could be susceptible to this as they sink through these layers of acidic water. This is a krill embryo about to hatch. You can see the limbs on the bottom left there. That's what will become the antennae of the adult krill, and that's what it'll use to make it swim. That's grown under normal conditions. And here you can see one grown under high CO2. The embryology is stopped at about day 1 or day 2, and this is never going to hatch. So we carefully measured where this tipping point was, and then working with colleagues to map how carbon dioxide is moving in the ocean, we're able to produce risk maps under different carbon dioxide emission scenarios. Now, when we wrote this paper in 2013, the business as usual carbon dioxide emission scenario, meaning let it rip, just keep putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, was still a real proposition. Things were not slowing down. And this modeling showed us that if we do nothing to slow carbon dioxide emissions, the hatch rate in some key areas of the Southern Ocean will drop to 50% by the end of the century. That's the hatch rate shown in the color there in this heat map. And by the year 2300, the ecosystem is absolutely devastated with only 2% of the hatch rate currently of krill. But if we do something about emissions, which we are now doing, and we go for, say, a high carbon dioxide emission scenario, peaking in 2080 emissions, then we end up only dropping that hatch rate to about 85% of the current level by the end of the century, and maybe 50% by the year 2300. And I'm pleased to say that with nations now shooting for a peak of emissions in 2050, we're going to come in underneath this. But this is the sort of stuff that gets you out of bed to go to work in the morning, because it is so important to produce science that can be tested and peer reviewed to inform government policy to set emission scenarios to protect ecosystems like the Southern Ocean. And indeed, all ecosystems on Earth need protection for what we're currently doing to the planet at the moment. So that's the krill. How much do the predators need? How does this look for the predators? And the most iconic of these is probably the Antarctic blue whale. Now, a conservative estimate would be that blue whale needs 4.9 million krill a day. That's 4.9 tons. And over a 4-month feeding season in the Antarctic summer, that's 600 tons. And with 3,500 blue whales in the Antarctic, that's about 2.1 million tons a season, or 5 times the current fishery required by krill, required by Antarctic blue whales. And interesting, just last week in Nature, a paper has come out re-examining how much a blue whale needs, and it looks like it might be 3 or 4 times this number. And it's well worth a look at if you just Google Nature and blue whale feeding and the iron hypothesis, and there's a lot more to talk about there, but we won't go into that. You can see that great paper. We also need to know, though, where are whales feeding? And this is pretty easy for humpback whales. And you can see these ones are swimming down past Shark Bay, which you're going to hear about from Mike in the last talk today, but he's going to be looking at sharks. We also tagged humpback whales on the east coast of Australia, but you can see all of these whales, no matter where they are feeding, during the year have got one thing in mind in summer, and that is to get to the ice edge of Antarctica. Antarctica is the white landmass down the bottom there, and they're all working along the ice edge, feeding on krill. And it's hardly surprising because it is an absolute bonanza. The blue whale is a much harder proposition to track because there are just so few of them left because of the catastrophic mismanagement of whales in the early 1900s. If we look at blue whale populations, they were taken down from some sort of 300,000 whales, and then only one in about 600 survived because they were such lucrative targets for the whaling industry. And it was not until the IWC banned whaling in 1964 that their numbers were able to stabilize. And we now think we have about 3,500 Antarctic blue whales, the largest animal that has ever lived or ever known to have lived. And while this is an enormous animal, finding it becomes a problem because it's like a needle in a haystack, admittedly a very big needle, but the haystack's huge, the Southern Ocean. And so to find these animals, we have to use different techniques, and we need to find them to find out where they're feeding and to find out what they're feeding on. What sort of krill do they need? So we do this using passive acoustic tracking. So these are sonar buoys, which are an ex-military device for hunting for submarines. They have several hydrophones in them that are directional. So they can not only record the sound and send it back to our ship so that we can hear that there are blue whales present, but also they tell us which direction they're in. I hope you can hear this. This is a blue whale. And this sound is sped up 8 times so you can hear it. You wouldn't hear it otherwise. And this is the typical Z call, and you can hear this for over 1,000 kilometers in the ocean because blue whales do make the loudest sound in the animal kingdom. But we don't need to be that far away from them because we can use these sonar buoys to track in on them. We get a bearing from each sonar buoy we throw, and then we can map the direction to find those blue whales. And here you can see some tracking data. We start in the bottom left. This is a map of a piece of the Southern Ocean. And every black dot is a sonar buoy we've thrown. The ship's track is in green. And you can see those red lines coming out from each sonar buoy. They're the bearings, the direction to blue whales. And you can see as we move along that track, we eventually get to an area where we're triangulating positions. All of those triangles are acoustically triangulated positions. And the green dots are where we then visually sighted blue whales. So by following that process, we were able to hone in on a patch of blue whales feeding. Now we actually do a similar thing in that we use acoustics to try and work out what krill is in the area where those whales are feeding. Now this is a survey we performed in February, March this year. And we basically sailed transects through these statistical areas that Camelar have ascribed to us to estimate the biomass of krill. And we do this principally using echo sounders. So the echo sounder shoots a cone of sound from under the ship in multiple frequencies, and we listen to the backscatter. And each time we get a backscatter, we put a mark on the echo sounder display. And so the computer generates this, and these are the schools of krill that we've just sailed over the top of. On the y-axis is depth, so you can see the surface there, and the depth of those krill schools going down almost 100 meters. And we know where they are because time now is where the ship is right now. This school here is 60 seconds ago, and back here is 100 seconds ago. And because we know the ship's speed, we know the distance to those schools, and we can measure the size of those schools. Now, these are very typical krill schools. What did we find when we got to the area where those blue whales were feeding? This krill school has been absolutely diced and sliced by blue whales. You can see large chunks of it are missing. The krill in the middle of it are totally freaked out, and they're trying to reform schools. And it's basically breaking the entire school into 3 schools, a bit at each end, and this blob reforming in the middle. So it's pretty clear that these krill were pretty tasty to those blue whales. But what we wanted to do was find out what sort of krill they were. So to do that, we need to drag a scientific net through it. This is a rectangular midwater trawl, and it has acoustic releases on it so that we can only open the net at a specific depth and shut it at another depth by sending a coded signal to the net. It allows us to know exactly what we're sampling, not just catch everything from the moment it hits the water. So the net's paid out, and then we use the echo sounders to target the net through the krill school. And if we get it right, it comes up full of krill like this. The krill are then brought in the cod end into the ship's lab where we sort out the contents. Now, typically, if you hit a krill school, you'll see this in the top right there. It's just all krill and they're randomly sampled. But on other trawls, if we get other zooplankton, then they'll all get sampled and enumerated and preserved as well as part of a mapping of the ecosystem. The krill, though, they're all measured under the microscope and they're sexed and their maturity stage is recorded. And all of this data goes in to informing the way we interpret the acoustic signal return. So we need this size spectrum of krill, which you can see in the bottom left, and that adds up to the final output from the survey, which is these krill density plots on our survey tracks. And that is what gives us our biomass estimate by using statistics to spread that data across the rest of the area. But at the same time, we take an opportunity to also observe the predators that are in the area. And so this is a team of 8 predator observers working on the ship during daylight hours with binoculars. And these are all the whales they saw during that 5-week survey. And you can see a bunch of different whales there. But I'd like to draw your attention to the top, to the Antarctic blue whale. We saw 2, perhaps 3 Antarctic blue whales in 5 weeks by chance encounters. It shows you just how powerful acoustic techniques are for finding these rare needles in haystacks. Now, final thing about krill is I want to touch on habitat, because we've always looked for krill in the surface of the ocean where the phytoplankton is, but over the last 20 years, there's just been reports coming in of people encountering krill in deep sea work in the Antarctic. And we wanted to find out how widespread this was. So on that same survey, we put a camera and trap system onto this CTD. This is an oceanographic device designed for going to the seafloor and taking water samples. And on the bottom of this, we have a camera system looking down at the seafloor with lights. And on the side of it, we have light traps, which are traps which have lights inside. And krill, when they're in the dark, are attracted towards light. And then we made 52 deployments of this device across the survey area. And we could only have done it with the computerized controlled heave control of this ship, because as the ship rolls, this cable, which is up to 5 kilometers long, then goes further down. And because we're trying to get within a couple of meters of the seafloor, if without the heave control pulling in and pulling out with each roll of the ship, we would have smashed this into the seafloor. But on top of that, we also have a little lead ball hanging underneath it, so that if that's ever unweighted by landing on the seafloor, it sets off an alarm and we quickly pull in line. Now, we got very used to opening these light traps when this device came back and seeing absolutely nothing. And indeed, this had been what had happened for the last 10 years on over 30 other occasions on 3 different voyages where we deployed this. We just couldn't find krill at the seafloor. It didn't seem to be happening. But finally on this voyage, we hit the jackpot and everyone was overjoyed. We brought back 180 krill in the light trap, the first ever seafloor krill, Antarctic krill samples ever recorded, which we'll put through isotope analysis to try and work out what they were eating. But it really was a great day. And of course, then we came to the camera system. We were able to download that and see the seafloor they were feeding on. And you can see the krill schooling around there. You can see one of their predators, a fish down on the seafloor that's probably wondering also who turned the lights on, because it would be completely dark at this depth. You can also see the steel ball just above the bottom there and the 2 shadows cast by the light, indicating we're just in the right spot. But this was great to finally get this. So we had a spatial survey telling us that krill didn't seem to use the seafloor that much during summer, but in some places they did. We saw it about 4 other places. So the next thing we wanted to do was find out what happens when we're not there, what happens for the rest of the year. So we also deployed these 3 bespoke moorings. And these are about $200,000 US each to build, because I know I've seen everyone wants to know how much this gear is, so I'll answer that question now. We deployed 3 of these, and they're about the size of a shipping pallet, and they sink down to the seafloor, and they have a color video camera system on them that records 3 minutes of color video every 5 hours for an entire year. They have an upwards looking echo sounder, which will detect krill as they come down or move across or head away from the seafloor to try and understand the flux of krill moving from the surface. And we also have a passive acoustic whale recorder to record the sounds of krill predators to work out who might be there eating them. Now, we deployed these on this voyage, and the top right image, you can see pretty much the day we deployed the ones that are Combi 1 and 2 there. And you can see that dark is the dark area is the open water. The sea ice is the bit we're right next to, and then the continent is where you can see Mawson and Davis Station. And we deployed another one over there in Prids Bay, Combi number 3. And then you can see the same area from another satellite photo in August this year. And you can see it's now totally covered in sea ice. And I find this really exciting because never before will we have seen what happens under sea ice when it's totally shielded in. You cannot even get a ship in there at that time of year. And our suspicion is that krill will move from the surface down to the seafloor to feed off the productivity of the summer before. So it will be fascinating to maybe get one of these back in the voyage that leaves just before Christmas this year. And we'll see how we go to understanding what has been a long-held problem in krill science. Now, to finish up, I just want to tie all this together. And this shows satellite tracks of about 17 different predators. And Danny gave us a great introduction to the power of satellite works on predators yesterday. This is work by multiple authors across multiple nations, all feeding into the Southern Ocean. And they've tagged a whole range of animals. And I could look at this for hours. It's so fascinating. You can see in the Weddell Sea, Weddell seals in the sea ice. You can see emperor penguins crossing the sea ice. You can see the sheet of Antarctic sea ice now growing out over the ocean during the Antarctic winter. But you can still see some life there, the emperor penguins, of course, breeding at that time in the Antarctic. And you can also see all of these albatross around the subantarctic islands as well. There's a hell of a lot going on, and not just fascinating, but this tells us about areas of habitat importance. And if we take this information and plot all these tracks onto a map, we can generate a heat map, a map showing the areas where animals spend their time. You can see the tagging sites in yellow, and the black is all the tracks of those animals. And from that, we can generate a heat map of overall habitat importance. So you can see that there is very high important habitat for predators around parts of the Antarctic coast, and also the subantarctic islands in the South Atlantic and the South Indian. These are breeding colonies for animals that can travel, can cover distance, like albatross. Not much going on in the South Pacific, but that's because there are no subantarctic islands there. There are no spots to stop. And then putting all this together, we can overlay on that our plan for marine protected areas. Now, this shows you the current marine protected areas in orange and proposed marine protected areas in pink. And understanding that on top of all of this, we have an understanding of where the krill populations are from the biomass surveys we and other nations do. All of this information needs to get brought together to understand this system as an ecosystem. You cannot manage ecosystems by looking at single species. Fisheries around the world are mostly overexploited or fully exploited. And the way to protect fisheries is to manage them from an ecosystem approach. And so these marine protected areas are about creating zones where animals can breed and survive, and they can reseed the areas that may become more heavily fished in the future. So in conclusion, Antarctic krill, I hope you'd agree now, really do matter. The fishery is growing, but it is very well managed from an ecosystem approach. This is a very interesting time to get into this sort of science, the unprecedented technological capability and opportunities for conducting research on krill and the ecosystem. But my overall take-home message is whatever fascinates you, pursue it. You really will excel at the things you find most interesting because you just cannot put them down. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. That was fascinating. It's hard to even sort of comprehend the scale of that many organisms and just the size of that system. Yeah, it's now time for Q&A. I think everyone is pretty familiar with how this format works. There's the Q&A box in Whova, and it looks like it's already pretty full of questions there. We're going to extend Q&A until 11:45. So we'll take a 10-minute break instead of a 15-minute break. So Rob has some time to answer some more questions. So without further ado, go to the Whova chat box, or excuse me, Q&A box, and vote for your favorite questions or add your own. And to start things off, Rob, there's a question from Stephanie here that a bunch of people have voted for that says, are krill in the Southern Ocean genetically the same as krill in the Northern Oceans, or are there different variations?
Great question. I mean, all krill are krill. They're in the Euphausid family, and so they're all related to each other, but no, they're totally different species. But the krill, the Antarctic krill, is one population of Antarctic krill. It's a circumpolar population. We don't see, the drift between, like with these, different spawners we saw yesterday having slightly different genetics. We don't see that in Antarctic krill. It is one population running around there. But the last common ancestor for krill was about 100 million years ago. And all the genera were in place 25 million years ago, and they all evolved about 300 million years ago when most of the crustaceans diversified. So they've been around a long time, but no, certainly the krill you have up there are different genetically to Antarctic krill.
Very great. Here's a good question. So is krill a bycatch of any fishery with respect to unintentional biomass depletion rather than the direct fishing? Do we have to worry about bycatch as well?
No, not really, because krill are small compared to the other fisheries in the Antarctic. The other fisheries are tiny in the Antarctic, but they're high value catches, things like Antarctic toothfish. An Antarctic toothfish is as big as me. These are big animals. So yeah, anything you're using to catch a toothfish, that's actually a line fishery. But even the trawl fishery for toothfish is going to let krill straight through. But we are concerned about potential bycatch in the krill fishery because there's a lot of stuff potentially with krill that could be caught, and that's fish larvae, squid larvae and things like that. And the fishing techniques for krill have come a long way. There are over 700 patents now on how to catch krill and process them. And they actually run a continuous trawl for krill, and they pump krill to the surface using an airlift pump. And the krill they don't need goes out the net unharmed. And we do need to do research to understand how unharmed they are and the other potential bycatch that goes through there as well.
Wow, fascinating. Here's one that says, an article in the Atlantic recently suggests that the krill populations dropped dramatically after whale populations were devastated by hunting. It suggests that iron from whale feces was key to feeding phytoplankton, thus krill, and that we might restore things by adding iron to the system. That might help to store carbon and plankton biomass and help whales and krill. What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's a great article. And that was the paper I was referring to that came out last week in Nature. And the Atlantic picked up on that. And it's long been recognized that the limiting nutrient in the Southern Ocean is iron. And iron is key for phytoplankton to get on with photosynthesis. And there's just not that many sources of iron in the Southern Ocean because iron comes mainly into the oceans through dust blown off the terrestrial habitat. Well, the terrestrial habitat in the Southern Ocean is covered by sea ice. So it's really only when icebergs break off the continent and scour bits of continent underneath them and then melt into the sea that we're getting iron added. So iron is a really important commodity. And it turns out that something like 30% of the iron in the Southern Ocean is locked up in krill. And so what you need is you need to eat some krill, and then you need to poo out the waste iron from those krill into the ocean, and that seeds the phytoplankton and turns it all over. So there have been experiments done where we've sailed in ships across the ocean, chucking out iron into the ocean behind the ship. And then with satellites, we've been able to record the huge bloom in phytoplankton that exactly matches the arc of the ship. So we know it works. And it's been suggested that we could use this as a method of locking up more carbon in the ocean. But the trouble is that it gets remineralized so quickly by the bacteria, it gets released again. But in terms of that specific question, and it's a great question, I think there's a lot of truth to it. It makes a lot more sense when we understand how many whales are there. I mean, those whales, the blue whales are using a huge amount, like 5 times of krill compared to the fishery today. And yet their numbers now are 3,500 and they were 340,000. It makes sense. That would, if you multiply that out, you end up with something like 400 million tons of Antarctic krill being eaten by blue whales each year before pelagic whaling. That's the same, almost the same as the biomass of krill today. So you just have to put 2 and 2 together. There must have been more krill. And it is very likely that the efficiency of the Southern Ocean food web at the moment is way low, because a key part of it, the whales that chew up the krill and excrete the iron back into the ocean, aren't there. So yeah, it's a great paper, and it's been something that's been needed to test that hypothesis.
And it's a lovely thought that ties in so well with our theme of predators and prey not being a win-lose game, but more of a delicate dance, a system that all interplays with one another. Thank you. There's actually a really closely related follow-up question that says, how much of the population growth in krill can be attributed to the increase in nutrients released by melting ice versus the increase in optimal ice conditions?
Well, it's very hard to say what's happening to krill numbers at the moment. I mean, there's, a paper came out about 10 years ago suggesting there was a tight relationship between reducing sea ice and reducing krill numbers. But reanalysis of that data, casts doubt onto whether we can be so conclusive about it. It's very hard to make firm conclusions about it. And I think the paper we talked about just before actually makes a lot more sense in understanding that krill must have been in greater numbers before. But examining, there's such a paucity of records of good scientific study, because the area is so big we need to study, and we don't have good numbers on exactly what is happening to krill at the moment. In terms of nutrients in the Southern Ocean, the sea ice that's melting isn't really changing things too much, because it doesn't have anywhere to get its iron from. But yeah, as more material drops off the continent, if glaciers do accelerate, which we expect them to do as the buttresses get melted away by warmer water coming in from underneath, which is one of the big risks with global warming, is that we accelerate the removal of sea ice into the ocean and raising sea level. That will increase the nutrients yet, but we certainly haven't got enough data to make any firm conclusions about that now.
Great. Well, there are two questions here from Wyatt. There's one is just if you could please point people towards where they can find that map with all the predators moving around, maybe the name of the program.
Yep. Yeah, I'll answer that on Hoover and put the paper that came from.
Perfect. And then the other question that Wyatt had is, how similar are krill to shrimp? They certainly look alike. How closely are they related?
Yeah, I mean, they're crustaceans. The big difference is that shrimp have chelate appendages, so they have pincers on the end of their feet, and they're detritivores. So they'll run along the bottom eating the crap that's on the seafloor and so forth, whereas krill are truly pelagic. They are designed to be in the open ocean, and they filter the phytoplankton in those front thoracic legs. And if you want to imagine you're a krill, imagine getting a couple of fly screens, which is something that's ubiquitous in Australia, and putting them on the end of your arms about 1 metre square and just scraping them through the air and catching flying bits of sort of hundreds and thousands and Brussels sprouts, particles in that sort of size range. That's pretty much what a krill does. So yeah, quite different. And of course, the key thing is their biomass. They're just staggeringly abundant.
All right. And then we probably have time for this one last multi-part question I'm going to piece together here, which is, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but do you perceive that krill oil as a detriment to the future of krill, especially with its rising popularity? And are other countries as ecologically minded when setting limits for krill? It seems like it would be hard sometimes to find international consensus on how much to harvest and how to set those limits.
Well, so far the Antarctic Treaty is working wonderfully. It's actually one of the best working treaties internationally on the planet. I'd like to think that that's because scientists really are a big part of that, and scientists know what needs to be done and so forth, and they're acting with integrity. But that krill fishery is managed by consensus. Nothing goes through CAMLR without every nation agreeing that is a signatory. So therefore, if you run a consensus organisation, everyone's in, because you don't get a plan unless you get consensus. So that's why it is so well run. And I'm confident about the way that's running. Krill oil itself, I certainly don't have a problem with it because it's tiny compared to the biomass available. And I haven't gone into the details of fishery management today, but the precautionary catch limit trigger levels that we've hit in the South Atlantic, they really are low, and the fishing does just move off. Every nation has to declare where they're going to fish, and CAMLR gets in touch with them as the trigger level gets close and they have to move to a different area. that protects the reproduction of the predators in those areas. Krill oil is a big player in why we go fishing for krill, and it's a high value commodity, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just as long as we take an ecosystem approach to managing the fishery.
Great. Well, that's perfect timing. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us.